Spooky goes on to say sources within the WNBA are now saying the league plans to release Sophie Cunningham in the offseason as effectively banish her from playing in the WNBA ever again. What did I tell y'all? They finna Colin Kaepernick Sophie. I knew it. Ain't no team gonna sign her. So I believe the Fever are going to release her. No doubt about it. Here's the thing. I don't believe another team is going to sign Sophie, guys. I really don't.
That is the claim setting this whole thing on fire. But notice what it actually is. An unverified claim about Sophie Cunningham's future, not an official announcement from the Fever, the WNBA, or another team. And that distinction is going to matter a lot, because the deeper you get into this story, the harder it becomes to separate what could realistically happen from what people online are convinced is already happening.
Now, the more her brands grow, I believe it might take a couple years for Sophie to possibly hang it up. She is 30 years old, but she is starting dialogue that this league has never seen before. And we need somebody like Sophie to remain in this league to expose the buffoonery that the WNBA has been doing. Because I feel like she has the courage to say what others are scared to say, even our very own case.
And that creates the first real question. Sophie is 30 years old, her profile has exploded, and suddenly people are asking whether basketball is even going to remain the center of her career. But there is another question hiding underneath that one. If Sophie isn't wearing a Fever uniform next season, would that actually mean she was pushed out because of controversy? Or could the explanation be much more ordinary? Because later, when you look at the contract situation and what teams actually have to decide in an offseason, that becomes a much harder argument than social media makes it sound.
Really do. It goes on to say the 30-year-old guard who joined the Fever in 2025 after 6 years with the Phoenix Mercury signed a one-year deal for 2026 that ends soon, fueling speculation about her exit. Her summer ESPN comments wanting to protect young girls from competing against biological men, which she called common sense, drew cheers from spectators and boos at games. Backers highlights her three-point shooting, enforcer style, and broad apparel, arguing the WNBA needs her more than she needs it.
Now we finally get something concrete to work with. Cunningham joined Indiana after 6 seasons with Phoenix, and the discussion here centers on her contract ending and what comes next. That matters because an expiring deal automatically creates uncertainty. A player reaching the end of a contract is not the same thing as a player being banned, blacklisted, or forced into retirement. But Sophie isn't entering this conversation as just another rotation player quietly approaching free agency. Her public profile has become part of the story. Her basketball value, her growing audience, her willingness to speak publicly, and the controversy surrounding those comments are now being mixed together, and that is exactly why this offseason could become so interesting.
Views. Yes, Sophie Cunningham, like, whether they like this or not, the pub that Sophie's getting them, they're getting talked about. You know, in press, there's always a story, right? And the story being that even though it's a bad story, there's never really a bad story because we're talking about it. Now, the WNBA could be mad all they want about this conversation surrounding men joining their league. But one thing I can tell you guys is that they gotta somewhat like this public.
This is where the argument changes from basketball to attention. Whether somebody agrees with Sophie or completely disagrees with her, controversy creates engagement. People post clips, they argue, they buy tickets, they watch interviews, they search for the player. Every new confrontation becomes another piece of content circulating around the league. That doesn't mean controversy is automatically valuable to a team. Organizations care about sponsors, locker room dynamics, reputation, performance, and 100 other things. Attention can become an asset or a headache, depending on what comes with it. But Sophie now has something that most role players never develop, an identity recognizable outside the box score. And once that happens, evaluating her future becomes more complicated than looking at points per game.
It's driving up views. It's driving up actually people going to the game. Because, like, just think about it. The people that wear the Title IX shirts, right? They paying $2,000-$3,000 for these courtside seats, bro, to wear these Title IX shirts. That money's getting collected somewhere. Somebody's profiting off of it. That's why I say all press is good press, good or bad. Forget the players, think about the owners. The owners don't give a damn. We ain't seen no owners besides the one in Seattle to come out and say something.
And there is the money angle. The argument being made is that even people showing up to protest or challenge what they see around the league are still entering the building, buying expensive seats, creating viral footage, and keeping the WNBA in the conversation. Now, we should be careful not to turn that into a claim that controversy itself is responsible for the league's business growth. The clip doesn't establish that. There are plenty of reasons people are watching women's basketball, but it does expose a strange tension. A league can dislike a particular controversy while still receiving enormous attention from the argument surrounding it. Those things can exist at the same time, and Sophie Cunningham has become connected to one of the loudest cultural arguments surrounding women's sports. That means whatever Indiana does next is probably going to be interpreted politically by somebody, even if the Fever's actual reasoning is basketball related. That's the trap. If they keep her, one side celebrates. If they don't, another side immediately asks whether she was punished.
Believe it. This post right here said the Indiana Fever plan on dropping Sophie Cunningham at the end of the season as to view her conservative fan base as a liability is unacceptable. Let's show them how many millions love Sophie. Left-wing media and WNBA sources are now saying Sophie Cunningham might be released from her team at the end of the season. Her future is subtly in doubt. Interesting. Does anyone seriously doubt this isn't because of her supporting women?
And right there is where speculation starts accelerating into something much bigger. The posts being discussed are claiming that Indiana could move on from Sophie and suggesting her views would be the reason. But no verified evidence is presented here showing that Fever management has made that decision because of her politics. That's important. You can absolutely discuss the possibility. You can question whether public controversy affects personnel decisions. You can watch how teams behave once free agency begins. But saying Sophie might not return is very different from saying the league has decided to eliminate her career. Those are two completely different levels of claim. And if we're trying to figure out what is really likely to happen, we need to keep those levels separate, because the strongest case for Sophie continuing to have a WNBA career may have almost nothing to do with politics. It may come down to something much simpler. Can she still help a team win?
Her summer ESPN comments wanting to protect young girls from competing against biological men, which she called common sense, drew cheers from spectators and boos at games. Backers highlights her three-point shooting, enforcer style, and broad apparel, arguing the WNBA needs her more than she needs it.
That's why the basketball part cannot disappear from this conversation. The clip itself points to three-point shooting and an enforcer-style reputation as reasons supporters believe she has value. Those are actual basketball considerations. A front office isn't building a social media debate team. It's building a roster. Can you space the floor? Can you defend your assignment? Can you survive playoff possessions? Can you fit beside the team's stars? Can you stay available? Can you contribute enough to justify the contract? Those questions matter because a player does not need to be a superstar to have a market. Specialists survive in professional basketball all the time when their skill set fits what teams need. And Sophie has another advantage. People know exactly what kind of personality they're getting. She's not suddenly becoming outspoken after signing the contract. Her profile is already public. Any team interested in her can evaluate the complete package before making an offer. That makes the idea that all teams would automatically refuse to touch her a much bigger assumption than it first appears. But this is also where the story becomes uncomfortable for Indiana, because even if the Fever make a completely basketball-driven decision, will anybody believe them?
Spooky goes on to say sources within WNBA are now saying the league plans to release Sophie Cunningham in the offseason as effectively banish her from playing in the WNBA ever again. What did I tell y'all? They finna Colin Kaepernick Sophie. I knew it. Ain't no team gonna sign her. So I believe the Fever are going to release her. No doubt about it. Here's the thing. I don't believe another team is going to sign Sophie, guys. I really don't. And I believe she's going to be the new Colin Kaepernick.
Listen carefully to the escalation there. It begins with, sources are now saying, without a clearly identified source in this transcript. Then within seconds, the commentary moves from that unverified claim to certainty that Indiana will release her. No other team will sign her, and Sophie will effectively become the WNBA's version of Colin Kaepernick. That is a massive leap. For that scenario to happen, we're not merely talking about Indiana deciding another player fits its roster better. We're talking about every potential WNBA employer independently deciding Sophie Cunningham has no place on its roster, despite whatever basketball value she might offer. Could controversy affect interest? Of course, teams consider more than statistics, but proving a league-wide blacklist would require evidence considerably stronger than viral posts predicting one, and that is the central tension in this entire story. There is a plausible basketball event at the center. Sophie could leave Indiana. Around that event, however, an enormous political interpretation is already being constructed before the decision has even happened. That means the sequence of events matters. If Indiana moves on, what does the team say? What does Sophie say? Does she receive offers? What kind of offers? Does she choose another opportunity herself? Does she retire? Does she pivot toward media? Does she continue playing? Those answers would tell us far more than speculation today. And this is where the retirement question from the beginning comes back.
And I just got to give you guys my personal opinion. I do not believe she will. See, without basketball, her brand really don't go, like, it don't correspond together. I like Sophie Cunningham. She's from my home state, and I feel like this is just the beginning of her story. Basketball and her remaining playing in the league can catapult her to do many things, but she needs basketball itself to do it.
That argument actually makes sense from a branding perspective. Sophie's increased visibility is connected to basketball. The uniform, the games, the opponents, the arenas, and the WNBA itself give her a stage that ordinary influencers don't have. Walking away voluntarily would mean giving up the thing that keeps generating new moments. Think about the difference between somebody commenting on women's basketball from a podcast studio and somebody being inside the league while those debates are happening around her. The second person naturally attracts more attention because she's part of the story. So unless Sophie simply decides she no longer wants the grind of professional basketball, retirement isn't automatically the obvious business move just because her audience is growing. In fact, continuing to play could strengthen everything else she wants to build. Every nationally discussed game expands recognition. Every interview creates another opportunity. Every strong performance gives supporters a basketball argument in addition to a cultural one. And that last part is crucial. If Sophie wants control over the narrative surrounding her career, playing well is probably the most powerful thing she can do, because performance forces the conversation back onto something measurable. You can argue about opinions forever. A made three is a made three. A defensive stop is a defensive stop. A player helping a team win creates a basketball case that doesn't require anybody to agree with her personally.
And I believe she's going to be the new Colin Kaepernick, bro. Something 80% of Americans agree. If the WNBA engages in the obvious form of discrimination, then the Department of Justice will be forced to step in. Yes, intervene. This is going to turn into a very, very bad situation. This might be the biggest story of the WNBA offseason, and that is what's going to happen with Sophie, bro.
Now the stakes get raised again with talk of discrimination, government intervention, and this potentially becoming the biggest WNBA story of the offseason. But we're several steps away from any of that. First, Indiana would actually have to move on from Sophie. Then we would need to know why. Then we would need evidence that any subsequent lack of offers resulted from an impermissible coordinated or discriminatory action rather than ordinary roster decisions. Without that evidence, jumping directly to legal intervention is speculation stacked on top of speculation. That doesn't make the underlying question meaningless, it makes evidence more important. And that's exactly why this offseason could become revealing. If Sophie becomes available and multiple teams pursue her, the blacklist theory immediately becomes much weaker. If she becomes available and receives little interest, despite clearly having basketball value, people are going to ask questions. If Indiana keeps her, the entire conversation changes again. And if Sophie herself decides she wants a different career, then the retirement rumors need to be viewed through an entirely different lens. There are multiple possible outcomes here, and right now social media is treating the most dramatic one as if it's the only one.
What's going to happen with her? The liberal media is already writing Sophie Cunningham WNBA eulogy. Her future is suddenly in doubt. Get released after this season. Why? Because she had the audacity to say women should be compete against women. Not because of her shooting, not because of her defense, because she refused to pretend biological men belong in the women's league. There'll be a platform, every activist who wants to erase women's sports then acts shocked when a player who defends them becomes controversial. This isn't about basketball. It's about punishing the one who won't play alongside.
This is the point where the political framing completely takes over. The argument presented is that any potential release would be punishment for Sophie's public stance rather than a basketball decision. Again, that's an interpretation, not something established by evidence in this transcript. And there is another problem with comparing every controversial athlete situation to Colin Kaepernick. The circumstances are different, the sports are different, the leagues are different, the contracts are different, the individual actions are different. Even the mechanisms through which teams make roster decisions are different. The comparison works emotionally because people understand what Kaepernick is supposed to imply. A player becomes politically controversial and then cannot find another job, but an analogy isn't proof. If Sophie becomes a free agent, the evidence comes next. That's when the basketball market gets to speak, and there is something else that shouldn't be overlooked. A team signing Sophie wouldn't necessarily be endorsing every public position she has ever taken. Sports teams employ players with all kinds of political, religious, and cultural opinions. The relevant organizational question is usually whether the entire package makes sense. Production, fit, salary, health, age, role, chemistry, public profile, and yes, potentially controversy. All of those can matter simultaneously. Reducing everything to one explanation before teams even make their decisions is satisfying for social media because it gives people a villain immediately. Reality is usually messier.
It's very similar to the Colin Kaepernick situation, bro. They're trying to Colin Kaepernick her. People can say what they want about Colin Kaepernick. He took a knee, and it's very similar to what Sophie did. Only thing different is Sophie didn't disrespect our country. She's just standing up for women's rights. And they're going to use the same way the NFL did Colin Kaepernick. That's what they're going to do to Sophie.
And now we reach the comparison the video has been building toward. The narrator sees Sophie and Kaepernick as two athletes whose political positions could affect their professional futures, while also emphasizing that he views their underlying causes very differently. But here's the part that should determine whether that comparison survives. What happens after Sophie becomes available? Assuming she becomes available at all. That's the payoff. Not rumors today, not anonymous posts, not predictions, actual transactions. Because if we're going to use a word as serious as blacklisting, there needs to be something observable behind it. Imagine Indiana doesn't retain Sophie and another team signs her immediately. That tells one story. Imagine Indiana offers her a new contract and she chooses to leave. Completely different story. Imagine she receives several offers and chooses the best basketball situation. Again, completely different. Imagine she receives no meaningful interest and credible reporting later shows teams were concerned specifically about the attention surrounding her public statements. Now you've got evidence for a much more serious conversation. Those distinctions matter. Otherwise, every free agent departure could be turned into whatever political narrative people already wanted to believe. And Sophie herself has a major role in determining which direction this goes. She isn't powerless here. If her profile really has grown as dramatically as the video argues, she potentially has leverage beyond a normal role player's statistics. She can speak directly to an audience. She can tell her own version of events. She can build media opportunities outside basketball. And if teams value what she does on the floor, she can negotiate from that position too. That's why the idea that she has only two choices, stay with Indiana or disappear, feels far too narrow. There is a whole league between those outcomes. There is also life outside the league. And there is a major difference between choosing another path and having that path forced on you.
Sophie, I called this. I knew it. Somebody, I don't believe in the gender nonsense. Men shouldn't be in women's sports. It is. It's just that simple. Hopefully, Sophie, this doesn't happen to Sophie, but I think it will, bro. I think it will. And I think they're going to try to ostracize Sophie. They're going to try to get rid of Sophie, bro. They want her gone. They want her gone, bro. No doubt about it.
So after all of that, where does the story actually stand? Sophie Cunningham has become a much more polarizing and recognizable figure. Her future with Indiana is a legitimate subject because contracts end and rosters change. Her public comments have clearly become part of the discussion around her. And there are people online predicting that those comments could cost her opportunities. What we do not have in this transcript is verified evidence that the Fever have decided to remove her because of those views, that the WNBA has ordered teams not to sign her, or that every franchise has collectively decided her career is over. Those are extraordinary claims, and extraordinary claims need something stronger than speculation. But that doesn't make this offseason boring. It makes it more important to watch, because Sophie's next contract decision could become a test of 3 different kinds of value all colliding at once. Basketball value, commercial attention, and organizational comfort with controversy. Those don't always point in the same direction. Indiana has its own basketball priorities. Sophie has her own career priorities. Other teams have their own roster needs. And fans are going to interpret every move through the cultural battle that has developed around her. That is why one simple transaction could produce completely opposite explanations depending on who is watching. Suppose Indiana lets her walk because it believes another player fits better. People who already believe Sophie is being targeted may still call it political retaliation. Suppose Indiana brings her back. People on the other side may argue the team is prioritizing attention over avoiding controversy. Suppose another franchise signs her. Suddenly that franchise becomes part of the argument. There may be no move that escapes politics now, but there is one way to keep the analysis grounded. Follow the evidence in the order it happens. First, does Indiana actually move on? Second, if it does, what explanation is given? Third, what does Sophie say publicly? Fourth, what does her market look like? And finally, does the eventual outcome match the claim being made today? Until those pieces exist, calling her future uncertain is fair. Calling her permanently banished from the WNBA is not established. And as for the original question about whether Sophie could simply hang up the sneakers and become a full-time media personality or influencer, I wouldn't assume that either. Basketball is still the platform connecting all these different pieces of her public identity. If she believes she can still contribute, and if teams believe the same thing, continuing to play gives her something social media fame alone cannot replicate: relevance generated by competition itself. That's why the next chapter may be more complicated than either the Fever keeps her or the league gets rid of her. She could return to Indiana, she could enter the market and discover another opportunity. She could decide the right offer isn't there. She could eventually build a career that combines basketball, media, sponsorships, and commentary. And yes, she could eventually decide she has had enough, but those are choices and outcomes that haven't happened yet. What has happened is that Sophie Cunningham has become big enough as a public figure that people are debating her future before her future has actually been decided. That alone tells you how much her profile has changed. Now I want you to make the call based on what we actually know. If Sophie Cunningham isn't with Indiana next season, would you assume it was simply a basketball and contract decision? Or would you immediately question whether her public controversy played a role? And if another team had the opportunity to sign her, should it judge her strictly on what she can bring on the court, or does everything surrounding a player have to factor into that decision too? Drop your answer in the comments, like the video if you want us following this story as the offseason develops, and subscribe because whatever happens next is going to tell us much more than the rumors ever could.